is sharpening his quill for a new edition of his book set to reveal huge secrets inside Prince Harry.
Here is a rewritten version that flows smoothly for voice generation, keeps the audience engaged, avoids pauses or headings, softens absolute accusations into reported speculation, and removes language that could trigger platform restrictions, while maintaining a dramatic narrative tone suitable for storytelling audio. He was sharpening his quill once again, preparing what many believed could be his most controversial work yet, a new edition promising revelations that would ripple far beyond palace walls, and the whispers had already begun long before Meghan Markle's birthday arrived, quietly circulating in online corners before erupting the moment she shared her polished celebration images, photos clearly intended to convey confidence, elegance, and a carefully curated glow, yet instead of admiration they triggered intense scrutiny as viewers zoomed in, compared past images, and dissected every detail until the conversation shifted from praise to curiosity and then into widespread speculation, with commentators claiming something felt inconsistent and social media users insisting the numbers connected to her age did not align with early acting records, resurfaced interviews, and scattered timelines. Most of it rumor-driven chatter until one name escalated everything into something far larger. Tom Bower, the investigative writer known for relentless examinations of public figures, with reports suggesting he had quietly gathered information for months and allegedly told contacts he believed Meghan's publicly stated age might not tell the full story, claiming he had come across documents that raised questions about chronology and image management, a discovery he reportedly considered too significant to ignore, prompting speculation that he was preparing to publish. And suddenly the media cycle echoed the same line again and again that Bower was hinting at inconsistencies. Analysts weighed in, online audiences dissected birthday photos, some attributing changes in appearance to stress while others insisted timelines did not match, and journalists familiar with Bower's work emphasized his reputation for detail-driven research, describing him as methodical, persistent, and rarely careless with claims, which only intensified attention as sources suggested he believed certain records including school documents and early professional listings did not align with the official narrative, while Meghan's silence through her representatives only amplified discussion rather than calming it. Supporters argued the entertainment industry often adjusted ages while critics claimed the issue was about credibility and transparency. Royal commentators noted that even minor discrepancies could invite deeper scrutiny given the institution's emphasis on documentation, and as social platforms filled with comparisons between early interviews and recent appearances, the debate grew louder, with defenders calling the focus unfair and critics arguing public trust was at stake. Behind-the-scenes reports suggested efforts to redirect headlines while the story continued to gain momentum. Insiders claimed Meghan felt unfairly targeted while others insisted Bower's approach had always centered on records rather than emotion, and when he appeared in interviews holding folders of documents he stopped short of direct accusations, instead pointing to gaps and inconsistencies and allowing implication to do the work, a tactic that ignited endless debate as clips spread rapidly, commentators arguing whether paperwork errors, reissued records, or narrative control explained the discrepancies. And when Bower followed up by presenting another document filed in a nearby district with similar details but a different year, the reaction intensified. Experts debated administrative errors versus intentional adjustments. Historians noted how carefully timelines are examined within royal circles, and speculation expanded beyond public curiosity to behind-the-scenes vetting. Yet throughout it all Meghan remained silent, a silence interpreted in countless ways, fueling sympathy, curiosity, and further storytelling, until Bower appeared once more stating calmly that he was presenting what he found and inviting response, reinforcing the idea of mystery rather than resolution. And by then the discussion had grown far beyond numbers, becoming a reflection of public obsession, perception, and narrative control, with one columnist summing it up by suggesting the fascination revealed more about the audience than any document ever could. And as the story lingered unresolved, one thing became clear: the intrigue was no longer about a date or a record but about identity, image, and the power of unanswered questions that refused to fade. As the days passed, the discussion refused to cool, and instead of fading into the background noise of celebrity chatter, it hardened into something more persistent, something people return to again and again, because unanswered questions have a way of staying alive far longer than confirmed facts ever do, and every new interview clip, every resurfaced photograph, every archived listing seemed to add another layer to a story that no one could quite pin down, yet no one could stop talking about either. And what made it even more compelling was that no single piece of information stood on its own. Everything relied on implication, alignment, and timing, and in the modern media landscape that was more than enough to keep an audience hooked, especially when the subject was someone whose public image had always been carefully shaped, carefully defended, and carefully debated. Late-night talk shows began weaving the topic into their monologues, not as accusations but as cultural commentary, joking lightly about how the internet could turn anything into a mystery, while still acknowledging that this particular discussion had unusual staying power, and online creators produced long-form breakdowns that walked viewers through timelines year by year, comparing interviews, casting profiles, and public statements, not claiming certainty but asking the same question in 100 different ways. Why do these details feel slightly out of step with one another, and why does that feeling refuse to go away? Meanwhile, royal commentators took a more measured approach, reminding audiences that public figures often experience exaggerated scrutiny, yet even they admitted this situation felt different, not because of the claim itself, but because of who was making it and how he was presenting it, never direct, never declarative, always framed as documentation that did not neatly align. And that subtlety was precisely what kept the conversation alive, because it placed the burden of interpretation on the audience rather than the source, and once people believe they are drawing conclusions on their own, the grip of a story becomes far stronger. Behind the scenes, industry insiders whispered that media outlets were scrambling to verify fragments of the narrative, calling former classmates, early colleagues, and casting assistants from decades earlier, most of whom either declined to comment or said they could not recall specifics, which only added to the ambiguity, because absence of confirmation does not equal confirmation of absence, and ambiguity is the lifeblood of speculation. And as journalists quietly chased leads that went nowhere, the public conversation continued to grow louder, less restrained, and more emotionally charged. Supporters argued passionately that the scrutiny crossed a line, pointing out that appearance-based judgments were unreliable and that timelines compiled from old promotional materials were often inconsistent by design, while critics countered that the discussion was no longer about visuals or industry norms but about narrative consistency, and that when someone builds a public persona around openness and truth, even small discrepancies invite examination, and neither side was willing to back down, because both believed they were defending something larger than a single individual, one side defending fairness and privacy, the other defending accountability and transparency. What made the situation even more complex was that there was no clear next chapter, no press conference, no official clarification, no document released to end the debate, and in that vacuum the story evolved, shifting focus from the original claim to the broader idea of how public narratives are constructed, maintained, and protected, and whether the modern audience has become too accustomed to curated authenticity, expecting perfection while simultaneously distrusting it, and Meghan became less a person in the discussion and more a symbol, representing everything people argued about regarding fame, image control, and media power. Tom Bower, for his part, remained consistent in his approach, appearing occasionally to reiterate that he was presenting what he found and nothing more, declining to engage in speculative hypotheticals while also refusing to dismiss the significance of inconsistencies, a stance that frustrated critics and energized supporters, because it allowed both sides to project their beliefs onto his words. And every time he repeated that invitation for response, the absence of one became louder, heavier, and more open to interpretation. Some analysts suggested the silence was strategic, a refusal to dignify speculation with attention, while others believed it reflected a calculated wait for the cycle to exhaust itself, and still others claimed it revealed concern about amplifying a narrative that could not be fully controlled once addressed, and without confirmation from any official source every interpretation remained possible, allowing the story to adapt to whatever lens the audience chose to apply. As weeks turned into months, the discussion matured rather than disappeared, losing some of its initial frenzy but gaining a more thoughtful, analytical tone, with long opinion pieces questioning why age, of all things, provoked such fascination, and whether the fixation revealed more about societal expectations placed on women in the public eye than about the subject herself. Yet even those reflective takes acknowledged that the persistence of the story was unusual, driven not by sensational claims but by unresolved contradictions that refused to settle neatly. In academic circles, media scholars began referencing the situation in discussions about narrative trust, pointing out how easily modern audiences oscillate between skepticism and belief, and how a single unresolved claim can overshadow years of documented public life, especially when amplified by algorithm-driven platforms that reward engagement over resolution. And in that sense, the story became a case study in how information ecosystems function, where certainty matters less than intrigue, and clarity matters less than momentum. Still, there were moments when the conversation reignited sharply, triggered by something as small as a resurfaced clip or a newly digitized archive, each spark briefly reigniting the debate before settling back into a low simmer, and with each resurgence the language became more careful, more legal, more qualified, reflecting a collective awareness that speculation carried consequences, even as curiosity remained undiminished. Those close to Meghan reportedly expressed frustration, describing the situation as exhausting and unfair, while those familiar with investigative journalism defended the right to examine public records, and the divide between those positions illustrated the core tension at the heart of the entire saga, the collision between personal narrative and public scrutiny, between lived experience and documented history, between who someone says they are and who records suggest they might be, and that collision was never going to be resolved easily or quickly. As time passed, some observers predicted the story would eventually be eclipsed by the next major headline, absorbed into the ever-churning cycle of news and controversy, while others believed it would linger indefinitely, referenced whenever discussions of credibility or media trust arose, not because of what it proved, but because of what it never conclusively answered. And in that sense its power lay not in revelation but in endurance. The most striking aspect of the entire episode was how little new information was actually required to sustain it. A handful of documents, a few mismatched dates, a respected investigator's careful phrasing, and a prolonged silence were enough to create a narrative arc that rivaled far larger scandals, demonstrating once again that in the age of constant content, mystery often outperforms disclosure, and implication often speaks louder than fact. By the time commentators began referring to the situation as a modern media myth rather than a controversy, it had already embedded itself into public consciousness, not as a settled claim but as an open-ended question, one that people revisited not necessarily because they expected an answer, but because the act of questioning itself had become part of the cultural conversation. And whether or not clarity ever arrived almost felt secondary to the role the story played in shaping discussions about trust, image, and the limits of public entitlement to private history. In the end, what lingered was not a date, not a document, not a definitive statement, but a sense of unresolved curiosity, the kind that survives precisely because it lacks closure, and as long as that curiosity remained, so too would the story, drifting through commentary, analysis, and quiet debate, waiting for either confirmation, contradiction, or simply the passage of time to dull its edges. Yet even then it would likely be remembered not for what it proved, but for how deeply it captured attention, reminding everyone watching just how powerful unanswered questions can be in a world that rarely waits for answers.